Okay, so I feel like the filming of this video has been quite dramatic. Like the reading for it has spanned from a 0.25 to a 5 star. So that was pretty dramatic in itself. And then my ring light went out. So you're going to have to bear with me because part of this video is a little bit darker than the first half, but hopefully it's still okay. So come and join me and find out what's been going on. Hi, my name's Mel and welcome back to Bookish Brummy. I like to review books, and every week I have a weekly video where I review all of the books that I've read in the last week, and that's normally around a prompt that I set myself at the start of the month and then read all the books around that prompt. So this month is K is May, which means that I can only read books from authors where their surname or forename begins with K. So I just thought that was a bit of a fun one to do because I actually have loads of books on my shelves with authors with the surname or forename K. So if you've been following along for the last couple of weeks, I've been talking on and off in the last few videos about My Men by Victoria Kielland. So this was published in 2021 in Norwegian, and then I believe the translated version came out in 2023. Now, I've not really had much good to say about this one, if I'm honest. It's basically a stream of consciousness, and it's written from the perspective of a lady called Bella Gunnis or Bella Sorensen. Now, Bella Sorensen was actually a real woman. She existed at the start of the 20th century. She was born in the late 19th century. Yeah, she was born in the late 19th century in Norway, and then she emigrated over to America and then eventually settled in Chicago. And she's responsible for the what I can only call as serial killings of quite a few men. But none of this was discovered until after her death. Now, there was a book the other year by Camilla Bruce called Triflers Need Not Apply, and that was also released in 2021. These were released within months of each other. And Camilla Bruce wrote a really, really good fictional account of Bella's life. Um, and you know, it was sort of based on the facts of what people knew about her, and then obviously she had taken some artistic license to try and pull that together into a story about Belle. And I really, really enjoyed listening to that on audiobook. That was one of the standout audiobooks for me last year. So I was really excited when I found this because I thought that this was going to be much of the same, and I really actually wanted to know more about Belle Gunnis's life. However, this has been very, very, very disappointing, I have to say. I was even considering doing a do not finish on it, but it's only 200 pages long, so I thought, you know, I will try and force myself to get through this because maybe I'm missing something, maybe it will get better. So as I say, this is completely different style to Triflers Need Not Apply. Triflers Need Not Apply is like a story, and we actually have several characters because we have Belle, we have her husband, we have her family, and they're all having conversations, you know, and it's sort of moving along like a traditional story. Whereas this is just a stream of consciousness from Belle's perspective. Now, the first thing I would say is this is really rambly. It's really difficult to understand what's going on. And I think that what really helped me reading this book is because I had previously read Triflers Need Not Apply, I had some kind of idea of actually what happened in Belle's life. So therefore, I was able to kind of pick up little bits out of this text and understand that that's kind of where we were in the timeline. However, if you didn't know anything about who this was based on, I think you would really struggle to understand what's going on. And I say it's very rambly as well. So it's just difficult to know what's going on anyway. And this just didn't get any better throughout the book. I didn't really feel like the tension was really there in this book. I felt like it was almost unreadable, and I can't work out if that's because that's what it's actually written like in Norwegian, or if this is just not a very good translation of the writer's work. So I'm going to read out a couple of phrases in this book so you can kind of understand like what I'm trying to say about. I feel like that the grammar was bad. I felt like the translation was probably bad because, you know, words were used that I don't really think should have been used in certain bits. But I've only tabbed 4 instances in this book to talk to you about, but honestly, it was page after page after page, and it just made it an absolute slog to read. And honestly, I feel like this is one of the worst books that I've ever written. If I've ever read, sorry. If I'm honest, and I normally try to be positive about books or find something positive, and I think that the only positive thing that I could find in this book was that the author had managed to get a book published. If the story is the same in Norwegian, like if it would translate the same into Norwegian, then I'm at a loss as to how this even get published. I really did not enjoy this. So I think, when I say like inappropriate words were used, or I feel like maybe a better word could have been used, there is this phrase here where it says, Belle smiled at her daughters over dinner, deep red and affectionate beyond all bounds. Maybe hope existed after all. They were staring at her with their urine coloured eyes. Urine coloured eyes. A second quote that I think I'm going to read to you, which is, her voice was still just as fake sounding, and her jaw ratcheted tighter. The light was so harsh. Bella was almost drowning. The fur was completely inside Bella's iris, and the cat's tail snaked up towards the ceiling and swung from side to side as the cat extended its claws. Everything Bella could get under her eyelids, open eyes, raw mind, it all grew and grew the more she pressed her face into its fur. Okay, so in this section, Bella has picked the cat up and has pushed her face into the cat's flank. But the way that this is described just is really horrible, to be honest. Like, everything Bella could get under her eyelids, it just makes it sound like she's trying to hold open her eyelid and cram cram the cat into her eye. Like, it's just not. It's just not sophisticated or nice at all in the way that that's written, and it's a bit confusing, really. So then there's another bit here. Bella took a deep breath, felt the never-ending faint prickling on her face. Love with its grotesque red formations had gone too far, and now she lay in a new bed in a big house like a crater of flowing hair. I don't even think I really understand what they're trying to say here. Grotesque red formations for love. What does that mean? Crater of flowing hair? I mean, maybe that means she's lying on the bed and her hair's around her. I don't know, but it's just very clumsily written and just not very nice, if I'm honest. So yeah, that's kind of like an example of how this book is flowing, and I just think that it really is either translated badly, or it just really needs some work on it. And what I'm finding really hard with this as well is that on the front, we have the Irish Times saying it's extraordinary, visceral. On the back, we have a quote from The Guardian saying that a singular novel of unusual power from a fearless and remarkable writer. And then we also have a quote from somebody else in here as well. The New York Times, where it's basically also giving it a bit of a, yeah, this is a good book sort of thing. And I'm just confused as to if these people actually read this book, because it's, or did they read it in Norwegian before it got translated into English? I don't know. But I would not recommend this book myself, and I'm going to score this a 0.5 star, which is the absolute lowest I've ever rated anything on my channel. But I cannot find anything enjoyable or redeeming about this book, I'm afraid. So sorry to say about that. So the next book I'm going to talk about, I'm a lot more positive about. So this is My Dark Vanessa, written by Kate Elizabeth Russell and published in 2020. So I just started reading this at the end of last week and just told you that I actually thought that it was going quite well, but I hadn't finished it, so I couldn't fully review it. So before we get started on this, I'm just going to put a trigger warning on this. This is about a young woman who is just under the age of consent, so she's about 15 years old, and she ends up having sexual relations with her teacher, who is several decades older. So it's quite a difficult subject matter, and I think that even when I started to read this, I was unsure whether this was going to be one of those books where you wish afterwards that you could unread it. However, I'd seen a lot of noise about this on YouTube, and people saying that it actually was a really, really good book and it was really worth the read. So I thought, well, this is completely different from what I would normally read, but I'll give it a go and see how the writer actually tackles this subject. So this is a little bit reminiscent of Lolita, where essentially we have the same thing going on, where we have somebody who is under the age of consent having sex with an older man. Now, Lolita came out obviously a really, really long time ago. I can't remember the year of its publication, but this book draws on that book really heavily. Now, I've never personally read Lolita, but I have to say, after reading this one, I am quite tempted to go and read it just so I can actually do a comparison back to this book. But our main character, Vanessa, is actually gifted a copy of Lolita by her teacher, so she is aware of the book Lolita and often draws parallels between her relationship with her teacher and the relationship in Lolita between her and the main protagonist. The difference here, from what I can tell, is that Lolita is written from the abuser's point of view, whereas My Dark Vanessa is written from the victim's point of view. Now, as I say, our writer spent 2 decades writing this book, and the reason for this is she actually started writing this when she was 16 years old. Now, means that the voice of our character, who is only about 15, actually has an age appropriate voice. So you really do get the feeling of the immaturity and the youngness of our character when this story starts. And then we have basically sections of the book which are Vanessa when she is 15 and she is going through this with her teacher. And then we have an older timeline, which is 17 years later, where Vanessa is in her 30s and she's looking back and reminiscing on what actually happened when she was 15. So our writer is also in her 30s. So therefore, the voice that she's giving to the 30-year-old, again, is correct because it matches, you know, her age. So I think that that's actually really, really good, and I think that's how she's managed to really nail it with the younger Vanessa and the older Vanessa, and getting them to sound like distinctly different ages. I think she's done a really, really good job of that. So, as I say, this is obviously difficult to read about because there are sex scenes in here that are described between young Vanessa and the teacher that she's having the affair with. But I feel like that they are treated respectfully, and they are written in a way really not to be sort of, you know, glorifying the sex in it. It's more about what the teacher is sort of saying to her to coerce her into the behavior that's taking part. And I think that's the really interesting aspect of it. And I think that this lends really well to the Me Too movement as well, because I think it kind of just shows that, you know, the coercion that can happen between an older person and a younger person to get sexual relations conducted can be really, really subtle. It's not just necessarily a case of, you know, somebody being outright necessarily attacked violently. It can happen subtly, and this is what is happening in this book. And interestingly, our main character is debating whether or not she's even a victim. She doesn't feel like a victim because it hasn't happened in this way, you know, where she was sort of violently attacked. So I think that this adds to the discussion about Me Too and what is classed as sexual abuse and coercion, and all of those things. So I think that that's treated really respectfully in here as well, and is really, really good. Now, the one thing that I took away from this book, which was educational and interesting for me, was to say the sort of discussion about what makes a victim. Now, from the reader's point of view, when you're reading this book, you can see that Vanessa is a victim. You know, there's no question of it. You can see that she is. You can see that she's being coerced into behaviour that she shouldn't be coerced into, that she doesn't understand properly at her age, and that she just doesn't simply have the emotional intelligence to cope or understand with what is going on. Um, but she herself, even as an adult, doesn't see herself as a victim for a variety of reasons that get discussed during this book. And I think that that's the really, really interesting part for me. So, as I say, it's difficult for me to recommend you to read this because, as I say, it's a really difficult subject matter and it should have trigger warning on it. But if you have read Lolita, um, and you thought that that was a good read, I would recommend to read this as a companion, even though I haven't read Lolita, but I'm thinking of going off and read Lolita as a companion to this because it's kind of like the other half of the story. It is the story from the abused perspective. And yeah, I did feel that Kate Elizabeth Russell did really, really well with this. This was her debut novel, so I'd be really excited to read anything else that she puts out in the future because this was really, really well done. And for such a sensitive subject, she treated it really, really, really well. Okay, so the next book I'm going to cover is another one that I'm not entirely that happy with, if I'm honest. So I then read Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka. I think I'm saying that correctly. So this came out in 2022, I believe, and it actually won an award. It won the Edgar Award for Best Novel in 2023. So in this book, we start off in the first chapter with a man called Ansel Packer who is on death row, and he's on his last day on earth, and he's counting down the hours before he is taken to the execution chamber. And he's, you know, running through his head his relationship to several young women that he killed earlier on. So he's on death row because of those murders, and he essentially murdered 4 people. The rest of the chapters are women who were in contact with those murdered women. So we have one character called Safi, who is a police officer who actually grew up in foster care for a few years with Ansel. And one of the victims was also another girl that was in their foster home. So he has murdered her at some point. Uh, and then basically, Safi is sort of put on this murder case to try and solve it. And she has suspicions that Ansel is the murderer, but obviously nobody wants to listen to her. If they listen straight away, then obviously we wouldn't have had the story. So that's one of our characters. The second character is Ansel's mother, Lavender. Um, and then the third character is basically the sister of one of the deceased. So we end up with following 3 women, and I think that the point of this is to follow the survivors, and those survivors kind of tell the story of the deceased women. Now, supposedly, because this book does say on the back, this is the story of the women who survive. But I'm not entirely sure it is, because like when we are in Ansel's chapters, we are, you know, in third person perspective. We're saying you. This is very much like his point of view, his mind of like what's going on, his controlling of the narrative. Like he's trying to tell you what to think about it. But then when we're in the other chapters with the survivors, we're not that, you know, it's just telling the story from afar, you know. So for starters, like the way that the book is sort of organized, it's like, no, this is definitely Ansel's story. um and then I felt like that the 3 women that were actually used, they were like not really of interest to me. I know that sounds really bad, but the police officer that was used, she was rather cliche, I think, throughout the book. Like the way that it was sort of written, it was like, oh, we have a a coloured person who is a female on the police force who is young. So basically, in the police force, they're suffering sexism, racism, and ageism, which makes it almost impossible for her to do her job. And I kind of feel like, you know, is that the story that we really want to be telling when actually it's meant to be about the person that she knew? And I feel like the person that she knew, when she often tries to talk about this person, she keeps going on and on and on about how she'd have been a great mother and this, that, and the other. But it's never actually stated that the character was pregnant when she died. So I find that very confusing. And, you know, it's almost like, well, could this woman not have been missed for any other reasons? Like, why are we focusing on the fact that she may or may not have had children and been a mother? I think that sort of got on my nerves a little bit. Yes, she might have been, but what if she wasn't? Does that mean that, you know, the loss of her life is not that important anymore? So that kind of like really bugged me. And I got to be honest, like I didn't actually really like Safi, the police character. And there's one quote that I'm going to read out as well that Safi made, which I found a bit questionable. So it says, "It was the scariest thing about being a woman. It was hardwired, ageless, the part that knew you could have the good without the hurt, but it wouldn't be nearly as exquisite." Now, I'm sorry, I've got to be honest, I don't feel like that as a woman. I don't particularly feel like I want to get hurt in order to have good. I don't really understand that statement. I don't think that it was great. Okay, so then there's also the character Lavender, who is Ansel's mother. I have to admit, I didn't think much of her either. I feel like her story was the most complex out of all the stories, and actually, she was a good one to talk about. But it's not that she survived Ansel, like is a survivor of Ansel in that way, because Ansel, the last time she saw him was about 4 years old. So Ansel has nothing to do with what happened to her, really, or the outcome of her life. The outcome of her life are the choices that she made, while Ansel was still 4 years old. So actually, I would say that Ansel is a victim of her life and her choices. And I don't think that that really gets enough coverage in the book. I felt that the mother was quite a weak character, and there were just certain aspects of her that I couldn't get on with, and I didn't feel like there was character, like real character growth in her in the book, for her to really, you know, understand how the part that she played in his life may have actually helped create the man that he had become. I felt that we could have actually got rid of Safi and Hazel, and we could have just had a story where we talked about Ansel and then his mother Lavender reflecting on, maybe what part she had played in who he became. I think that would have been a really interesting story. So she was the most interesting of the three women that were included in this, but yeah, I just didn't like her character. I didn't think that she was written, in the way that I thought that she would be for this story. So the third character, Hazel, again, so we're talking about her sister who died. So we obviously follow Hazel's life a bit. But I'm going to be honest, Hazel also is quite an unlikable character, and I couldn't work out, throughout it really, if she actually really did love her sister or she was just kind of jealous of her. And it felt like, they were twins, and so it felt like, that, while her sister was present, she felt like she was a half of a whole. And then when her sister died, she suddenly became one person. And I wasn't really sure if she was pleased about that or not. Um, so yeah, I didn't think much of that character either. So I've got to admit, like, I did not feel the same way about this book that a lot of reviewers on Goodreads felt. A lot of people really liked this book and it obviously won an award, but for me it was severely lacking in several things, and lots of things that I wish that it would have said that it didn't say. So again, I've got to be honest, like, I'm not going to rate this very highly. I'm going to give this a 2 star because I definitely don't want to read this again. If I'm honest, I just didn't enjoy it. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read this one, and what you think of it, like what your take on it is. Okay, so then the final book that we're going to get into, again, I'm going to be more positive about this one. So this is Homeseeking by Karissa Chen. Now, this was published in January 2025, so it's a relatively new book. I had not actually seen this in the UK, but I'd seen some American YouTubers talking about how great this book was. So when I went to Miami about 2 months ago, I managed to pick up a copy of this in the airport and was really excited to read it based on the reviews that I had already seen on YouTube. Now, I have since found a paperback copy of this available in the UK. So I'm just going to put the cover up on the screen now, and I believe you can find that at Waterstones if you look for it. I don't think that that cover is obviously as nice as this cover, but the inside of the book is like absolutely fantastic. So this is a historical fiction, and basically we are following two characters, Hyowin and Suchi. Now, the book starts off in the late 1930s when Hyowin and Suchi meet each other at school, and they're probably about 7 or 8 years old, or maybe even 6 at the time. And basically, Suchi offers Hyowin her lunch because he's a new kid and he's getting picked on. And then from that moment, they are always together and they're the best of friends. And then we jump on a decade, and basically, Hywin enlists for the army, and he basically has to go and fight for the capitalists, like the nationalists. So during this time, our characters are living in Shanghai, and they are living in the area which is being protected by the British because the Japanese have occupied China. So then we then have the occupation lifts, and then we have basically, the disagreement between the communist faction and the nationalist capitalist faction about who is going to rule the country. And so basically, Hywin ends up enlisting, and he then has to go and fight against the communists. However, the communists end up basically gaining traction and winning, and so Haiwin ends up not being able to return home to Shanghai. So from, a young age of about, I think he's about 16 or 17, he's not actually old enough to go, but he lies about his age. He ends up having to leave Suchi. Suchi, meanwhile, remains back home in Shanghai with her family, and they are basically going through, a terrible time where essentially everybody's, allegiances is called into question as to whether or not they are, supporting the communists or supporting capitalism, and basically there's starvation and it's just absolutely awful. There's people trying to get out of China, and they can't, the doors are like closed to them. So, there's a suffering going on with her family, and then obviously Hywin has gone off into the army. So we start this story like we start the story with Hywin and Suchi kind of meeting each other, and then we understand that they've been parted. But then we then start the story over in 2008, which is like 70 years later, when they are much older. They are sort of turning 80 at this point, and they have emigrated to America and managed to escape China quite some time ago. So this story is very heavily about diaspora as well, and they both have their own stories about what they've gone through as to why they ended up having to leave China and the route that they took to do that, and how long they've actually been in the USA. And they somehow meet each other, and that's why we begin to recount their story, um, and what happened when they were apart up until this point. So they were actually being apart longer than they were actually ever together in the first place, but they still have like a strong connection, and that's when we start to understand their story and what happened. Now, this is an absolutely fascinating read. I believe this might be Karissa Chen's first novel, and it is just absolutely outstanding. She really, really brings to life, what was happening in Shanghai at that time, and it's a really devastating story. It's just absolutely devastating across all fronts, if I'm honest. I think that I'd read a similar thing in Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans. He is also writing a story about being in the the protected settlement in Shanghai, um, and during this period where we basically have war between the communists and the capitalists. So that might be a good partner read. If you've read this one and you're looking for a similar thing, you could maybe read that one. I read that one earlier this year and thought it was great, but it did kind of remind me of this one. But this is obviously a lot bigger. There's a lot more detail in it, I think, because we're just following more characters than we were in the Kazu Ishiguro one. Now, I've got to be honest, like, I thought that this was absolutely wonderful. I was really, rooting for all of these characters. I thought that they were all beautifully, beautifully written. And there's one quote that I really want to read you from this book, which I think will really stay with me forever because I think it was just absolutely beautiful. Suchi knew that home wasn't a place. It wasn't moments that could be pinned down. It was people, people who shared the same ghosts as you, of folks long gone, places long disappeared. People who knew you, saw you, loved you. When those people were far flung, your home was too. And when those people were gone, home lived on inside you. So, absolutely fantastic. And the prose is absolutely beautiful in this book. I'm going to mark this one as a 4.5. Why is it not a 5? I hear you ask, given that I enjoyed the read so much. Yes, I absolutely did enjoy reading this. I totally recommend it, and I would read this one again in a heartbeat. But there were a couple of little niggles in the book, which is the only reason why it is not scoring a complete 5. One of them was a continuity error over clothing. So we are in one scene where basically Suchi is in this bar that she's working in, and it tells you that she's wearing like a black outfit, and then she starts a conversation with a man who sort of begins to assault her. So this whole thing is probably going on over like 10-15 minutes, and then it describes her as wearing a green dress. So again, I think that that continuity error could have probably been picked up. And then another thing that kind of got to me slightly is that I feel that Hiowin's character throughout this book is really, really, really well developed. We can really see who he is as a child, and we can really see him as an adult and how he's grown, and he often reflects back on himself. When it comes to Suchi, a lot of what we know of Suchi, we have like her sister Sula saying, "Oh, like you're a survivor to Suchi, and she's hard, and she gets what she wants, and she's not afraid to speak her mind." And we keep hearing that, and I feel like Highwind says the same thing to Suchi. He's like, you're never afraid to speak your mind. This is the person that you are. But in reality, as we follow Suchi through the book, that's not really the way that she is at all. She seems like a very meek and pathetic at times, if I'm honest, character who just lets everybody walk all over her. She very rarely stands up for herself. And there's a scene in this book where she's sort of raising her son with her husband, who is not necessarily the nicest of people. And they get into an argument, and her way of protecting her son is basically like, just do what your father says, even when he's being totally unreasonable. Now, her sister Sula is in, the vicinity when this is happening, and her sister Sula comes in and actually stands up to this man, and then says to Suchi afterwards, like, you don't want your son to become like him, so therefore you have to take control of this situation, um, and teach him that actually no, like your husband is wrong in this, in this matter. And this all came about because the little boy, something had happened to him in his day at school. And so essentially, his mother had taught him to do one thing, and then his father came and totally contradicted that later on. And then when his father was contradicting it, she was telling him, like, no, do what your father says. But this is for like a child who's about 5 or 6 years old. Can you imagine how confusing that is? Like, no, do this, no, do this. No, well, actually, he's correct. Don't do what I said. Um, and again, I felt like if she was a strong woman, somebody who didn't mind speaking her mind, she would have stood her ground there. But she didn't. And I think that throughout the book, like when we actually looking at her son and the things that he's saying, he seems a bit annoyed with her that she's such a pushover to this guy. And he begins to sort of realize as he gets older that, his father is not always correct, but he also, harnesses some degree of disappointment, I think, in his mother that she is not a stronger person. So it all points, like the actions in this book, points to me, Suchi not being that strong of a character, if I'm honest, like as in not being assertive, not able to assert herself for herself or for her son. Whereas, the other two main characters, her sister and Hywin, seem to have this impression of her that she is this really strong, outspoken person. And, I'm not really sure like where they are getting that from, because actually what we're seeing of this character is no, she's not like that at all. So there was a bit of an imbalance there for me, and I have to admit, at times the Suchi character did annoy me slightly because she was so, I say, pathetic. Sometimes I felt like she could have been a lot more assertive than she was. But that's not to say that I didn't like her overall. I did. There were just aspects of her that annoyed me. But overall, the Hyoin and Suchi story is just absolutely wonderful. I'm not really one for reading love stories, if I'm honest, but this was just absolutely brilliant, and I totally recommend it. And I think it's because it's not traditional love story in the sense of it's romantic and we've got loads of like smutty scenes. That's not what's happening in this book. I think there's like one small smutty scene in here, but it's not written in a smutty way. It's written in a nice way, and it's kind of like expected, I think, that you would get at least one of those scenes in this book. But it's not, in a huge amount of graphic detail that's, might turn somebody off reading it who is not into spice, because I'm not really into spice and I coped with the scene quite well. But it's just, it's thoughts and ideas about how people feel about each other is really the love in this book, I think. And it's not just about, romantic love between Hywin and Suchi. It's also the love for, your parents and your children and you know, your siblings. So yeah, I just thought that this book was absolutely fantastic. Just scoring it 4.5 because there were a couple of little points in there which I think, you know, just bring it down from that 5 for me. So I've had an up and down reading week, I would say, because I've read the worst book that I've ever read, I think, in the last few years. I've read another book that I thought was going to be great, which wasn't that great. I've read a book that I was scared to read because I wasn't sure actually about the content, and it turned out to be an absolutely fantastic read. And then I finally got around to reading Homeseeking, which I was assured was a brilliant book, and it actually was a brilliant book. You know, it was able to cash its own check in that respect. So yeah, it's been an up and down week, but there's definitely a couple of books in there that I would recommend to you. So we're now at the end of Kay's May, so I'm not going to be following this challenge anymore. There will be one further video which comes out, which will be the Kay's May retrospective, and that's where I'll get all 10 books that I read this month, and then I will rate them from my least favourite to my most favourite, and just say a little bit about each one, but won't do a full in-depth review. If you want to see the actual reviews for the book, then just go through the Kay's May playlist and you'll be able to see me review all of those books individually. And some books that span across a couple of weeks get a few mentions. So if you've enjoyed this video, please press the thumbs up button, and if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. I promise you I will try and sort out the lighting before the next video, and there's just not much I can do about it today, and I'm not sure that I'd be able to get a new ring light within the next 2 days, and I don't want to push out this video even further because we'll just end up in a backlog. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye!